this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did Special Forces operations affect the outcome of the American Civil War? Our guest, Patrick O'Donnell, is the best-selling author of more than a dozen books. He has appeared on a previous Scholar Talk episode on his book, The Indispensables, a great page-turner about the Marblehead Regiment that helped to ferry Washington's Continental Army across the Delaware. His most recent book is The Unvanquished, about Special Forces operations in the American Civil War. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks and starting a new series on the American Civil War. Patrick, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
It's an honor, Tony. Thanks for having me on again.
Great. Just another great book, a real page turner, some great narrative nonfiction, compelling historical research, and really just a great story. It's sort of an untold facet of the Civil War. You know, we sort of, read a lot about Lincoln, and we read a lot about the various battles and Vicksburg and Gettysburg and Battle of Bull Run and so forth. All important stuff, but you really bring to light this new episode, so I'm excited to talk about it.
I'm excited to talk about it with you too.
Great. So why don't we start with looking at the formation of these special forces? So can you tell us a little bit about Mosby's Confederate Rangers and the Jessie Scouts on the Union side?
Sure. This book is about the Jessie Scouts. That is the through line of the Unvanquished. And from there, we hang off the men that they fought against, that they interacted with. And that would be Mosby's Rangers, some other irregular forces, but also the Confederate Secret Service, which is really an untold story as well. And the origin of this, though, is in 1940, 1941, America didn't have special operations forces. They had what was known as the Coordinator of Information, or the Office of Strategic Services. And they had to quickly come up to speed and figure out what to do with special operations forces to create them. And they had to create them overnight. But what Wild Bill Donovan did was he assigned some of his best scholars to look at American history. And the period of modern war, which begins in the Civil War, is where they really started to look first. And it's the units that they looked at, which is the story that I tell for the first time in The Unvanquished. And it begins with these incredible Jessie Scouts, or Lincoln Special Forces, as another name that was used for them. And their origin begins in 1861 with General John Fremont, and it's in the Missouri area, where there's a raging, it's brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and they need sort of irregular forces to deal with these irregular forces. And the birth of the Jessie Scouts occurs. And the name Jessie Scouts comes from General Fremont's wife. And one contemporary source said that she was the better man of the two. And she was an extraordinary woman. And it's no wonder that these men, these scouts, admired her. And they formed a small unit, about 50 men. They were all volunteers, highly trained. General Fremont was known as the Pathfinder because of his exploration of the American West, his involvement with the War of Mexico and California. But he employed Kit Carson and other scouts very effectively and transferred that to the American Civil War. And that's where the Jessie Scouts are born. Their leader is a guy by the name of Charles C. Carpenter, who's a fascinating man, too. He's a braggart. He's a good spy and commando in his own right. I mean, he literally infiltrates Fort Donelson to gather crucial intelligence, comes out, even disguises himself as a woman. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. But he's got this sense of exaggeration. He claimed that he was with John Brown. He escaped in a drainage ditch. I mean, the guy is remarkable, but, he's got a darker side. And one of those darker sides is he likes to steal pretty much anything that's not nailed down. And the Scouts get a very poor reputation for discipline. And just their characters is in question. He's literally cashiered out of the Army. And the scouts kind of go away to some degree, but a small element of them remains. And they go with a General Milroy, and it sort of goes along. And what they're doing at this stage, though, is they are guiding the army. And what makes them very unique is that these men wear Confederate uniforms. They're out front. They have to. In order to gain the element of surprise, to kind of go between the lines, they wear their enemy's uniform. And that is a perilous, perilous thing to do, because if you're caught, you're considered a spy and you're executed, either by a hanging or you're shot. And that's exactly what happened with many of these men. And this is a story that is very engaging. It's a narrative history. It's not some sort of dry retelling of the story. It puts you in the saddle of these men, or the boots of these men, as they're going behind the lines. They're leading the armies. And the Jessie Scouts are taken over by General Averell, who's quite an extraordinary general in his own way. Basically, he kind of screws up, and he's given a backwater command in West Virginia. And it's here that the Scouts really earn their chops. They are in this irregular warfare of our 35th state, which, oh, by the way, happens to be a slave state as it enters the Union in 1863, which is quite fascinating. But it's brother against brother as well in West Virginia. And it's also about guarding the vital supply lines and rail lines. And much of this story revolves around raiding the railroads that are there. And Averell sends his scouts on some very, very perilous missions. But within this story emerges America's first counterinsurgency group, they were also Jessie Scouts. They're known as Blazers, Independent Scouts. And they go after the irregulars in West Virginia. But this is the JV squad for what they really have to face. And that is John Singleton Mosby, the greatest partisan commander in American history. And John Singleton Mosby is an extraordinary individual. And he is kind of the anti-hero of the Unvanquished. 5'7", 128 pounds. Begins his career in the winter of 1862, going to Jeb Stuart in a mansion called Oakham, which is right outside of Middleburg. You can still visit it. What's cool about this book is you can visit the places that I write about. This book is a road tour waiting to happen. And I'm also a willing guide for those that want to pay for it. But anyways, that's another story.
Can I sign up for that?
Sure. This is amazing stuff. You can visit these places. Oakham is still there. So in the winter of 1862, he meets Jeb Stuart and says, I want to volunteer. I want to create a partisan group in Loudoun County, Prince William County, and disrupt Union supply lines and tie down thousands of federal troops. And Jeb Stuart says, fine. You got 6 guys, including one guy that has a club foot, and make it happen. And that's what they do. They're these completely unarmed, poorly armed guys that then start to harass Union supply lines. But Mosby is just a brilliant, brilliant strategist. Totally understands guerrilla warfare. He is creating it as he's going along, and they start to tie up a tremendous amount of federal troops. Their numbers grow. Volunteers start to show up, but their greatest mission is a mission to capture a Union general. And it's an extraordinary story. Within this story is also remarkable characters like Mosby, including a guy by the name of Big Yankee Ames, who's a Union deserter from the 5th New York Cavalry that just walks into their lines and says, I want to volunteer to be a partisan. And they're like, well, hold on a second. Who are you? They think he's maybe a potential infiltrator, but they send him on a mission with another ranger to find his own horse. And he's unarmed, and he has to infiltrate behind the lines. And he steals a horse from the main Union area, which is Centerville. There's a huge cavalry garrison and fort there. Comes back, and then Mosby decides to use him as a way to get through Union lines. And it's only, a couple dozen men that in the middle of the night, in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of a rainstorm, They penetrate once again Union lines, and they take out a Union general. And it's an incredible story, absolutely amazing story. And it just begins to grow from there. And it's no wonder that the OSS used these men for that for that for their origins and for inspiration, because there's so much rich stuff here. What's old is new. What is occurring to this day is irregular warfare is impacting all of our lives. All you have to do is look at the Middle East and the Quds Force in Iran, the Houthis. All of these things have elements of this story.
Right, and you're right. It's a story that tells itself, but you tell it very very well. Lots of great details and very interesting story. So did they have to overcome perhaps a certain amount of skepticism of opposition by leaders of the regular army, especially with these 19th century notions of honor and manhood and facing off against your enemy in war? You know, what was the view of these irregulars?
Absolutely, this is the story of irregular forces in American history in general. America has a rich story of irregular warfare, beginning far before the French and Indian War. But there's always this almost sine curve where they build up something and then they lose it, and it's not a learning organization, so to speak. In World War II, for instance, there was a complete resistance to anything that was irregular. They thought it bled off good men to the regular army, to regular forces. This is exactly what was going on in the Civil War as well. They felt that these men would be better placed with the regular troops that were fighting battles, etc. And anyways, they bled them off, but they quickly realized that there was some serious value to what they were doing. And what this book goes into is it's a small story that tells this larger story of unconventional warfare during the Civil War. Both sides were employing it, especially the South. They felt that irregular warfare could change the course of the war. And had the South employed it, especially at the end of the war, it's been proven in the 20th century and 21st century, insurgencies that have the support of the population are almost impossible to defeat. In the South, with all of its men that were lost, every family that lost a member completely still supported those that were there. And it was an overwhelming percentage of Southerners that would have supported an insurgency, which would have made it extremely difficult to defeat. But it's these men in this book, these Jessie Scouts, that do defeat it eventually, through their actions at the end of the war in particular. But they're always overcoming this stuff. But it's the Confederate Secret Service, and even with some support from General Lee, that he encourages them to look towards the Democrat peace movement of the time, which was the Copperhead movement, which is a very much an untold aspect of the Civil War as well. They are the rising movement within the Democratic Party, and they wanted peace. They wanted an armistice, and it's the Confederate Secret Service that really influences them tremendously. This book isn't about just ambushing wagon trains and blowing up, bridges and things like that. That's all cool. It's high level stuff that we see today. It's election interference. It's going after the press, which at the time, I mean, there's a great line in there. The democracy controls the press. And that is a very true statement. The Northern press was anti-Lincoln almost completely, and they were preaching an anti-war message. The Confederate Secret Service plied them with money to write the story of, this is a forever war. It's impossible to win. There needs to be a political solution to solve this problem. There needs to be a course correction. This would be the Confederate platform of the Democratic platform for 1864, which the Confederate Secret Service in part helps write, because their main asset is the leader of the Copperhead movement, a guy by the name of Valendium, and he's an Ohio congressman that is exiled to Canada. And much of the intrigue in this book takes place in Montreal, where the mint juleps are served year round in the most opulent hotel there. They cater to Confederates that are in exile or Confederates that have gone over the border, or even prisoners of war. And it's here that many of these covert operations are hatched. And it's a fascinating story.
Right. And yeah, so many fascinating things. I mean, you describe how these special forces are launching raids against supply lines, against railroads, trains, against bridges, sneaking through enemy lines with assumed identities, ambushing the enemy, even kidnapping officers, as you said. Can you describe a few of their tactics and their effects, how they went about this?
Their tactics were innovated during the war, under pressure. And this is especially true with the Confederate Secret Service, which has this obsession with technology and gadgets. And I love this. It's kind of all the Hughes Laboratory from James Bond. It's everything from the coal torpedo, which is a piece of coal that's been hollowed out to, insert gunpowder and then covered over. And then these things can be hurled into the steam engine of a boat or a train, and they disabled many Union supply lines in this manner. But then there's also some really sophisticated stuff like that I got into, which is the election interference, seeding the press. But it's also in many cases more tactical, where they're wearing the enemy's uniform to infiltrate behind the lines. In the case of the Jessie Scouts, they perform a very vital duty. There's no radio communication. They are providing communication between armies. They are also providing tactical intelligence directly to the commander. And this is incredibly vital and crucial to General Sheridan. And General Sheridan is the commanding officer that really takes the Jessie Scouts from Averill and crafts them into something that is a strategic asset that really fuels his army. And this is an untold story of how he's able to pierce Confederate lines because he knows where the weak points are, thanks to the intelligence, the real-time intelligence that his Jessie Scouts are providing him. And they are riding into battle with him in some cases, or they are far ahead of the army, in enemy uniform, scouting out formations and figuring out weak points, and also delivering messages to fellow armies to coordinate.
Right. And was there a certain kind of man, certain characteristics that the leaders of these special forces units were generally looking for?
These were extraordinary individuals. Anybody that Mosby had, they were excellent athletes in most cases. They were crack shots. They were also very intelligent individuals. The Jessie Scouts in particular had to pass off as a Confederate, and they were often captured. They had to talk their way out of a situation and convince their captors that they were indeed the real thing. And they were so convincing that they were like chameleons. They could change their persona to whatever unit that they were trying to impersonate. And they were, in many cases, very highly effective. There are 7 medals of honor that were awarded to individuals within the Jessie Scouts, but many of these men would never return home, and including their leader. And that is why this book was an untold story until I wrote it.
And there, as you described, if you've sort of dipped your toes in the waters a little bit for this question, just thinking about their actions, how their intelligence really is crucial to the outcome of several battles. You mentioned Fort Donelson, mentioned the 1864 election, and several other key battles, political moments. How do special forces operations affect the American Civil War?
A number of ways. The 1864 is really a crucial inflection point. And if you look, it needs to be looked at and examined in a different manner. If you look at it from the perspective of the Confederacy, for instance, at that time, at the beginning of 1864, they actually held out quite a bit of hope, even though in today's perspective, it's a different perspective. But things were not going well with Grant's offensives at all. In fact, it was one meat grinder after another. There were hundreds of thousands of Union deserters. There were hundreds of thousands of casualties. The war was wearing on. It was costing a fortune. And one of the things that I get into is Jubal Early's raid in this book, and it was led by irregular troops. In fact, Harry Gilmore is one of Gilmore's partisans, is one of those individuals, and they have a number of special operations associated with that raid. One is to take out the massive recapture all the prisoners at Point Lookout in Maryland, and also they go right at the Washington D.C. and they nearly capture it because it's a shell of itself in terms of those that are manning the defenses. One of them is a relative was in my family with the 150th Ohio, and they were supposed to be in rear guard duty. They were so-called 100 days men. He was a farmer from Solon, Ohio, and they were thrown out in front of this massive Confederate army that was bearing down on the Capitol and about to overwhelm it. But this is one thing after another where Lincoln is convinced that he will lose the election, and it looked that if they had taken Washington, for instance, or even just burned it or partially burned it, it would have been a political defeat, and everything was going poorly for the Union. The burning of Chambersburg is very much a high watermark, and just things look so hopeless. And it's the Jessie Scouts that really have a pivotal role in changing things, and that is especially true with the Third Battle of Winchester, where they provide crucial intelligence. They're a conduit in providing crucial intelligence that one of the Southern brigades in Jubal Early's army is being transferred back to Richmond. And it comes through sort of an unlikely source. The Scouts are not only proficient with special operations, but they combine it with intelligence and intelligence gathering. And they make friends with people. And one of the people that they befriended was an enslaved man by the name of Thomas Laws, who's really one of the great heroes of the American Civil War. I visited his grave, and is outside of Winchester. But Thomas Laws risks his life to deliver a message from the Jessie Scouts and General Sheridan to Rebecca Wright, who's a school teacher, but is living in a very much divided family. Most of her family fights for the South. She's an abolitionist, and she tells Thomas Laws through the Scouts that there's this crucial intelligence, and that changes the course of the Third Battle of Winchester, which changes the course of the war, which, along with the Battle of Atlanta, it's a defining political moment for the Republican Party, or I should say Lincoln, in his party at the time, which then gains tremendous traction. But it goes back and forth, and the Scouts are also involved in the Battle of Cedar Creek, which is a near disaster for General Sheridan, but he makes his epic and famous ride on his war horse and rallies the troops, and that's just an amazing story in and of itself, and how they turn everything around there, and it turns around the election of 1864.
Right. Yeah, just so many fascinating little stories and nuggets in there. A book maybe, or a question that maybe outside the purview of the book per se, but what ties can you make between the special forces who are among these first special forces in the Civil War and the special forces today, which you've written a lot about.
This is a book about individuals that had to innovate and operate on their own and operate with a great deal of independence and make things happen. I mean, all the books that I've written in one way or another are about individuals that are at the right time at the right place, that through their actions or their agency bend and shape history. And that's certainly the case with these men. And we see it today, how special operations and irregular warfare is bending and shaping history. And I think that's the lesson that America really should should garner, especially in today's forces, that it's the individual. That's your most important. Your human capital is your most important asset. It's not the tech. It's your human beings, and in fostering them in leadership. There's incredible leadership that is displayed in this book, from General Sheridan on down to, many, some cases, sergeants or privates that have to do extraordinary things.
Right. Well, that's a great lesson for all of us to leave us with. So, Patrick, I want to thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on your really very highly readable, well-researched, magnificent new book, The Unvanquished.
Thank you, Tony. It was a pleasure and an honor today.
Great, thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other interviews in our new American Civil War series on our channel. Thank you.